music literally represented the resilience and resistance to oppression. And this is I'm just introducing you to a modern day composition called Requiem for Rice, which was done by my colleague Etta Fields Black. And you can take a look at this on the web. It's wonderful. It's a classical rendition of trying to remember this period of slavery and what it meant to plant rice under those kinds of conditions, while also contributing to the wealth of America without much, I should say, credit for having done so. So that's the weeping time. I want to say, because I'm talking to librarians among you and book lovers, I want to remind you a little bit of some of my sources. I am indebted to the Library of Congress and the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and all these different places. I mean, I feel as if, I honestly do feel like librarians are some unsung heroes. And so it's wonderful to just give them some credit in this presentation and just say, I could not have done it without not just the primary sources, but people who helped me to navigate some of this. And then last but not least, I did a lot of oral history interviews. So that's the other side of the book, where I interview up to 15%, where I find up to 15% of people of African descent who are descended from that auction. And I try to make those connections between the past and the present. The other bit of my work is, again, I'm trying to give you just a kind of a quick sketch of some of the work that I've been up to in the last few years, of course, is, as was mentioned, the 1619 Project. So let me say a little bit about that. First of all, the 1619 Project commemorates a period in American history, which is really critical. And the New York Times seized upon it, but for many of us as historians, we've been teaching that 1619 is a very pivotal date. And so in 2019, it was the 400th anniversary of African presence in the US. Now, I want to be very clear that there were some Africans who were here before, but of consistent African presence, meaning from 1619 onwards, you had a steady flow of Africans who were forced to migrate through the slave trade, mostly through the slave trade, from 1619. And so I want to say that I want to really salute the Times in many ways for just making, what was a historical fact, something much more publicly known. And I want to say that Nicole Hannah-Jones, obviously, who was the originator of the project, and others reached out to 30 plus of us to be a part of this project. And as you know, it's become somewhat of a cultural phenomenon in terms of people's reaction pro and against it, but we can talk about some of that in some of the Q&A. I was then, after that original project came out in August 2019, I was asked to actually do some follow-up and do my my own, if you will, research, present the results of my research on other auctions. So beyond the Weeping Time auction, to look at auctions around the country. And so you may have seen this, maybe not, but let me just share a little bit with you. Hopefully you can see this without any problem. For hundreds of years, enslaved people were bought and sold in America. Today, most of the sites of this trade are forgotten. And so these pictures that you're seeing, that was in the New York Times article, follow-up article to the major project, but also part of 1619, that was in February of last year, about a year ago. And what we tried to do was to look at all these different places, if you will, where enslaved people were sold, and where, I want to get us back here, where they were sold. Can you still see?
And if
yes?
You are sharing the screen, you need to unshare it and then reshare with that, change it to the Chrome browser.
Okay.
Sorry to step in.
That's fine. No, thank you. Thank you. I think, can you see it? Can you see me now?
We see you. So if you go back, if you reshare the screen again and then have the choice of application window or Chrome browser, you want to pick the browser.
Okay.
And it should pop up again.
Okay, so I'm here. There we go. Just you can see me now. It
Yeah,
should
we can see
say,
the PowerPoint now. Yeah.
it should say groundbreaking civil rights legislation.
Yep.
Great. So part of what the 1619 Project tried to show is that from 1619 to present, there has largely been this legacy of slavery, which is still with us. And that from the point of view of many of the authors, that the legacy of slavery is really foundational to the creation of the United States. And it's still very much a legacy that we are grappling with. I would add that from my perspective, yes, there have been important gains. And these are some of the gains that I show here, right? The Brown versus Board of Ed in terms of integration of, school integration and so forth, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in particular, because that's the reason that we exist right now on a multicultural level. Why I can look, if I could look out at all of you, I am sure you reflect all the colors of the rainbow. I'm sure you reflect all the different cultural backgrounds that makes our country this melting pot. So the Civil Rights Act is the one that really says no to discrimination, and not just in terms of race, but also in terms of gender. So it's also the reason for myself as a woman and for the women in the group, for the women in the audience, to have the opportunities for employment, for work, to have the opportunities to either work at home or to work outside the home, and to have that to be an absolutely free, absolutely up to them to make those types of decisions. And so I want to say that there have been many gains, and a number of the gains that this Black-led civil rights movement brought about have been, I should say, they were very important for many other groups. So it's not just that they benefited Black people, but they benefited many other groups, including, as I've said, women. And that's something that I think has to be said. It was not perhaps said, in exactly that same way, but I think we need to know that that's also a part of how I see 1619, that yes, there have been gains. The problem is that those gains have not had what I call spread effects. And I want to say that this is something that I'm really working on in my work right now. I'm trying to think about this idea, which is an economic idea. And, it's an idea in the field of economics about spread effects. If you look at the picture I have there, in economics, they talk about kind of a core versus a periphery, right? And this idea that when you strengthen the core, right, sometimes periphery gets left out. And I'm looking at ways in which we can think about the civil rights movement like that. Like, yes, you have this growing middle class because of these civil rights laws and because of this new legislation and so forth that happened in the 50s and the 60s, but there's still a lot of people on the periphery, still a lot of people in the Black underclass specifically, who represent kind of a persistent poor. There's another good book called Truly Disadvantaged, which talks about some of this. So I just want to say that, it's, again, that's the 1619 picture. It's that, yes, slavery is a reality, is still with us, in part because even the gains of the civil rights movement has not trickled down to still many people of African descent. Many of us have benefited, like myself and others, but not enough of us have. The spread effects have not been as wide as we'd like them to be. So that's the 1619 argument. Let's get to the 1776 argument. Now you can see this, you may have heard about this, and so I just want to, I don't have to say an awful lot about this, but I think you should know that there is this report called the 1776 report. It came out, our former president sponsored it and put together a whole panel, and very much in opposition to the 1619 project. The idea there was, in the words of those who were a part of this, that we needed more patriotic education. Patriotic, I would put patriotic in quotes because I do not see, thinking about slavery as something unpatriotic, but that was the idea behind this report. And I will say that there were some historians involved, but I think there were probably many more historians who would refute some of the ideas behind this report. But let's talk about the essence of what I think they were trying to get to. So I'm going to be trying to be as non-judgmental as possible. I'm going to try to give you a sense from the other side what I think they were trying to tap into. The folks who were looking at 1776 as the real beacon for us. And of course, our standard and traditional beacon, and I would never doubt any different, that that is our founding. They were really looking back at the Declaration of Independence, obviously, and also the Declaration of the Rights of Man in France. And so looking at these revolutionary documents and the fact that they exemplified freedom, they exemplified this idea of, you know, a new man, if you will, a new person, right? And this was all connected to these Enlightenment ideals. And so these ideals were incredible ideals. And I would argue that the men, they were men who came up with some of these ideals were heroes in many ways. That would be my argument, because these ideals were so aspirational. They were not the lived reality, for example, of those who, you know, signed off on the Declaration of Independence or those who wrote our Constitution. It was not the lived reality. Many of them were slaveholders. But nonetheless, the ideals on paper left us a blueprint that we could then try to follow, if you will. So I just want to say that the people who are behind this idea, behind 1776 movement, they're not completely wrong. They could never be completely wrong. The issue is, how do they see it, and how can they look at it in a larger context? So many of them, as you know, will trump this idea of we the people, give me liberty, give me death. I mean, these are, you know, this focus on America as a beacon of freedom and of light to the world is where they choose to put, you know, to put their emphasis. And they do not see 1619 as complementary to that. They see it as in conflict with this idea of America as a beacon of freedom. So much so that a number of those people on that camp are attempting to ban the 1619 curriculum in schools. And this is kind of an interesting development because, you know, these are the states, I think there are maybe even one or two more that have added themselves to the list, and it's happening on the state level. And again, we can talk about that and what you think about that, but I think it's interesting that there is such a sense of protection, in quotes, of this notion of the 1776, you know, ideals, that there's a sense that 1619 in some ways would threaten that. So now let me get to this question of reconciliation, because that's really what I want to leave you with thinking about today. So you have the 1619 camp, and then you have the 1776 camp, if you will. How can we reconcile the two? In many ways, I think, and I think you might agree, the divisions in our country are great. And this is, we're divided for many different reasons, but certainly on this issue, this is part of it. This is part of the divisions that we're dealing with right now. It's not exclusive to this. It's not only about race, but I think this is definitely a piece of it. And I wanted to share this book with you. Some of you may know this book. If you don't, I would definitely suggest that you get it and you take a look at it. It's a powerful, amazing book called Silencing the Past. And in this book, Michel Rolfe-Troureau, what he does, he really tries to show that when we look at history, historically, there are multiple perspectives of history. You know, in this book, he shows that the French historians who wrote about, because this book is largely about, it's about many things, it's in general about history, but it focuses a lot on the Haitian Revolution of 1791. And he talks about how the French historians who wrote about Haiti and Haiti's revolution in 1791, they pretty much excised it out of history. So earlier I was just talking to you about the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Well, guess what followed the heels of the French Revolution? The Haitian Revolution. But how many of us, including myself, learned that in school? How many of us knew that, oh, there was another revolution just around the corner, and it had a great impact, in fact, not only on Haiti as the first Black republic, who then got their freedom from the French. They fought for and won their freedom from the French, not only from about Haiti, but that influenced America. See, going back to that transnational way of looking at things, that enslaved Blacks in Southern US, they heard about. They absolutely heard their masters complaining about what's going on in that Haiti, rebel Haiti. We sure hope nothing like that happens over here. They heard about what was happening in Haiti, and they were excited. They were looking forward to their own freedom. They were practicing their own forms of resistance. And in fact, what's interesting about that is that they took if you will, a certain kind of inspiration from this incredible event that the Haitians, also enslaved, but enslaved by the French, could wrest their freedom from the French. And they thought, perhaps we will not be long before we are also free. Yet, the French historians wrote little and nothing about the Haitian Revolution for decades, decades and decades and decades. And it's only now in the last couple decades that we're starting to put Haiti back into the history of the Americas and the history of the Western Hemisphere. So I'm saying this to say to you that we have got to start getting comfortable with having multiple perspectives of the past. The French historians had one perspective, but then the Haitian historians, and now hopefully more in general, all historians have a kind of more complex idea of the past. And that's something that we've been uncomfortable doing in America, is having multiple perspectives. We can actually have multiple perspectives and have opportunities to dialogue about those perspectives. Not multiple truths, but perspectives about that past. And then finally, I just want to say that what's my answer to reconciling this history? It's not either or, it's both and. It's not 1619 looking at the history of slavery as being foundational to America in total opposition to America as a 1776 beacon of light. It's both. And at the risk of sounding as if, I can't make up my mind, we can hold two things. And I think we need to learn how to to look at what appears like two opposing things. We need to be able to hold them. We need to be able to hold them together and try to understand the tensions between them. And so here, that's really what I'm suggesting, that those Enlightenment ideals of the Declaration of Independence, they do exist. They were important. They were heroic, but they existed alongside a history of slavery and its legacy. And somehow we need to be able to grapple with that. And if we can, I think that will be like a new foundation for our society, to be able to look at both those poles and understand that we are the product of both, not one versus the other, but both. And at the same time, I hope that we will realize that this legacy has an impact on everybody, including immigrants. It's not something that is only for those who were there back then, it's for everybody. And that in the midst of it, Black agency is critical and important. The ability of people of African descent to not only resist, but stand up for their rights, fight for their rights, and also help to extend rights to others, which I think is such an important piece, and I'm happy to talk about in the final Q&A. As I close, I want to say that in the absence of ruins, we have only memory. And I think about this a lot because, particularly for people of African descent, when they were taken from the continent of Africa, you couldn't bring your heirlooms, you couldn't bring artifacts, you don't have anything physical that you can bring with you when you are forced onto a slave ship. You have what's in your mind and you have what's in your heart. And that's what you bring with you as a legacy. And so the memory of that is really critical. And that's one of the reasons why I do memory studies. And I think where it comes to this question of reconciliation, we've got to reconcile things like the weeping time and a slave auction that is very much a part of our history. And it was one of millions. It wasn't just one of a few thousand. There were 1.2 million slave sales, in our history prior to the end of the Civil War. And that's a part of our history. That's a part of our memory. And we've got to own that. Likewise is a Statue of Liberty, which represents that 1776 ideal. Going back to that, that's also a part of our history. And that's been such a beacon for so many. And yet we sometimes forget that this very same Statue of Liberty was given to us by France, and this collaboration came about because they were helping to celebrate with us the end of slavery and the end of the Civil War. And we forget that. It wasn't just that the Statue of Liberty represents a beacon of light to immigrants from Europe and all over, but that it also represented the end of slavery. We've got to hold these two things, the tension between slavery and freedom. We have to find a way to remember our history along both these lines without thinking that you're unpatriotic if you remember one without the other, and without being able to recognize some of the heroic parts of our history, which I think obviously the Statue of Liberty very much represents. So I'm going to close here and just say one last thing to you, because I said that it's reconciling 1619 and 1776. It's the debate for the soul of a nation. And, you know, what comes to me when I think of that, this idea of soul, a lot of us talk about that. You hear a lot about that on the news these days, the soul of a nation. I think there's even a program that's going to cover some of these issues and look at probably in some of what I'm talking about. I think that's coming up in a public history program. And it reminds me of a phrase that Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King often said, and he said it in 1968 in a speech at the National Cathedral. And he says, "We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." Well, I want to say we shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards freedom. And so as we hold these two poles, as we hold them in their tension, and there's a tension between them, my hope, my prayer is that we will choose freedom, that we will choose categorically in this new era for America, we will turn the corner and choose freedom. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to share with you, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was incredible. We already have quite a few questions. Teresa and I are going to kind of take turns asking these of you. So the first one says, "Thank you for this talk, Dr. Bailey. I often encounter fellow Californians who view slavery as solely Southern history, racism as a primarily Southern problem, and the Civil War and its legacy as a conflict that includes the Western U.S. only tangentially, if at all." Could you provide your thoughts on this or some resources that provide a deeper look at the history and impact of the U.S. slave trade on the West Coast?
That's kind of a longer story, but let me give you, and I can send you a couple titles at some point, but let me give you the big picture of that, because I think I hear you, and I hear you're saying very clearly, you know, is slavery just a Southern problem? And that's one of the reasons why I was so happy that you reached out to me. And the more people from around the world and whatever region reach out to me, I'm always happy, because as I mentioned to begin with, the history of the slave trade is transnational, and slavery is transnational. It's not just transregional, it's transnational. It affects everybody in the Western world. There is nobody that doesn't either benefit or get disadvantaged in some way. There's absolutely no community that doesn't. Let me give you a quick example. Where I'm from here in New York, you know, they like to boast about when slavery ended in New York, and it ended sooner, before the Civil War, and so forth and so forth. Well, the fact is, they forget to mention that, you know, the slave trade, it wasn't just being carried out by European slave traders, but South Street Seaport, South Street Seaport, which is this wonderful place for people to enjoy, fish and meals and restaurants and so forth, that was actually a trading center. That was a place where slaves were brought in. Slave ships left there and went to the continent and brought slaves not only to New York, but also to the South and elsewhere. So I say that as an example to say that it's a very big picture. Everybody is connected in one way or another, and the country as a whole benefits, even if the region itself is not completely mired in slavery as they are in the South. So it's a great question, and it makes me know that you're thinking beyond just a region. Thank you for that.
Okay, I'll read the second question. Thank you, Dr. Bailey, for your talk. There's a lot of opposition to teaching the 1619 Project in schools, as it is considered a part of the advancement of critical race theory education in our schools. Why is there such an opposition to teaching the history of our nation, both good and bad, to our kids?
Well, it's like I said, again, recognizing that we have had a lot of this history has been hidden for such a long time, right? A lot of it we have, students still say to me, I've been teaching now for 25, 30 years, and students still come and say to me, we learned like 2 sentences or 2 paragraphs about the history of slavery. Now, I want you to think about this, right? The history of slavery goes basically from the 1650s, 1660s to the end of the Civil War in 1865. We have about 250 years of our history is slavery. I did the count today when I was getting ready to talk with you, and I can't remember what the number is, but we're like 150 something, 157 years or so out of the history of slavery. Does that make sense to you? So in other words, we've spent in our history more time, 250 years, we've spent more time with the history of slavery than we have with the history of freedom. If you think about it like that, and yet there are 2 paragraphs in our students' history books. It doesn't even logically make sense. Does that make sense? It doesn't even logically make sense. Aside from what you think about it politically, decide what your gut feeling or concerns or personal feeling, it just doesn't even logically make sense. So I think part of the opposition is because we have hidden that history for too long. And that's not your fault or mine, but what can we do about it? It's time to start teaching it. And as I said, if we can teach it in what I think is a more balanced way, yes, there was a history of slavery, but yes, there are these incredible ideals of freedom that came out of that period too. It's a contradiction. It's an incredible contradiction. Let's stop living this contradiction. Let's try to make our words on paper and our lived reality much closer to something that works together.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question is, can you elaborate on the oral history interviews that you did? Who was interviewed and what did you learn?
Okay, I interviewed a number of amazing, first of all, I think they're real heroes to me because a number of them are these descendants who, I didn't, they were already, I think I played a role almost as a journalist, if you will, because a number of them were already digging into their history. And can I say to anyone that's listening now, and that's whatever your background is, go into your history. One of the first places to start is in your own backyard, with your own history. And you don't have to be looking for anything in particular. In their case, they were looking to connect themselves to their enslaved ancestors. And they had a sense of, through oral history in their own family, that they might be connected to this big auction, but they didn't know for sure. In some cases, they had no idea. So these people are, again, to me, they're like private investigators, and they were doing this before it was popular to do this. And before we had ancestry.com and all these different resources, which can help you with some of this, by the way. And what they did is they made those connections, through census records and all different kinds of records. They started to make those connections. In some cases, I met people and I helped them make those connections. I helped to verify some of the records that they were doing. Because as a historian, obviously, I can tell when something is, is a veritable record and something is not a strong record to base any kind of conclusion on. They are now, this is the good news, many of the ones that I have met are, public officials, educators. There's such an interesting arc to this, and to a one, every descendant that I have met that has done this historical work, I want to say quite simply, they're not statistics. I'm not saying that their lives have been easy. As people of color in this country, they still face a lot of the struggles that we all do, but they are not statistics. They are not, people who don't have a sense of who they are. They have such a strong sense of who they are. And that has translated into them being just amazingly, important contributors to society. And so I don't know, I can't prove that there's a connection between knowing your history and, the kind of person you are in the world. But if I could prove it, I think they would be great proof to exactly that.
The next, could you speak more about how the U.S. was shaped and made possible by slave labor?
Using my weeping time example is a great way to look at it, because sometimes it's good to just kind of zero in, I talked about the rice plantations, and let me back up a little bit. Let me back up to 1619. One of the things, I didn't want to go too long, so I didn't get into this as much, is that 1619 is important as a date because it's again, the first consistent presence, right? There are like 20 or so people of African descent who are brought here. But for the most part, they're brought to British, colonial Virginia, but they're actually more like indentured servants, not slaves. And so they live amongst white indentured servants. And some people will be surprised to know that they actually, they could marry, they could, marry their white counterparts. They also could, testify in court, all things that, in a number of decades would be completely off limits. And I think most of you know that interracial marriage was not fully allowed until the 1960s, across the country. But can you imagine that in 1619, from 1619 to 1662, so call it about 50 years, those early years, there was some semblance of equality in America. Can you imagine that was America? Can you imagine? You think about where we are today, think about where we are today. And that during that time, those white and Black servants had some kind of freedom to move about and to make decisions, to plan, to live, to plant, to own land even. Imagine that. Somewhere along in the 1660s, economic decisions took over, and that's the bottom line. So if you ask, and you're asking, well, how did enslaved labor shape the US? That's when it happened. At some point in 1662, it was decided that the Black woman, in fact, whatever progeny she would have, whether she had them with a white man or a Black man, however that came about, whether it was consensual or it was rape, she would be the bearer of enslaved people forevermore. Her children would be slaves forevermore. There would be no more indentured servitude. There would be no more flexibility amongst the races or what have you. No. That her progeny would forever, that was the words, forever be enslaved in perpetuity. And that does not change till the end of the Civil War. It took a Civil War to change that. So, economics took over. Economics took over in Virginia, and it took over in the other colonies, and then the others that became states. It became the rule of the day that we would use this labor that was coming in from the continent as, permanent servitude with no options out, or few options out, I should say. Good question. I hope I haven't given you too long an answer, but I wanted to give a little bit of the arc of this so that you have this sense that we could have taken another road, but we didn't because of economics. What will we do now?
Interesting. Okay, so without burning out, how do activists continue to push silenced BIPOC stories to the forefront effectively amidst the opposition from the supremacy?
White supremacy. Well, I think you have to, first of all, know that you have to play, as they say in sports, you have to play the long game, And I think that's for everybody. I think because again, I'm not in a position where I can see all of you, but I can imagine that if you come to a presentation like this, you have an inclination towards some of what we're talking about. And if you want to, see change and see more change, I think you cannot be in it for the short haul. And I want to be very clear about this. And I say this often and much around the country. You have to want, number one, you have to be in it for the long haul. We did not get here overnight, and we will not get out of this rabbit hole quickly. It's the difference between the other day I had a headache and I took a pill and it went away. This is not one of those situations where there's a quick fix like that. So you have to be in it for the long haul. You have to have a certain level of persistence and perseverance. You have to be committed to education, because education is the key in my mind. And one of the reasons why I'm happy to talk to a university, happy to talk to libraries, because you have all these avenues, both formal and informal education. And I would love to see, I'm sure you do some of these, I know you do these types of programs. I would love to see libraries doing more Saturday schools and all kinds of things that you can do in these programs way beyond the official months of Black history or women's history, which I'm sure you do anyway, but just to say that, just to encourage you that you have such a role to play, a huge role to play, I think, in kind of correcting the miseducation that we've all suffered. So can I just say to the person who's trying to get those stories out, keep on doing it. Just keep on trying, and, look for informal and formal avenues to get your stories out.
Okay, I'll read the next question. What are the parallels between slavery and the modern prison system?
Okay, so one of the things that the 1619 camp, to go back to the camps, very much makes those connections. And can I just say that I'm very proud to be a part of the 1619 project. I don't think anybody there, and I will certainly just underscore that there's not a direct line between the history of slavery, the period of slavery, and today. Does this make sense? That, too many things happen in between. For us to say, whenever my students say, well, it's just like it happened during slavery, I said, oh, really? It just can't be just like, right? You can't be sitting in a classroom, in a college classroom, in a multicultural classroom, and say it's just like, when education was banned for people of African descent, when people of African descent who, one of the first things they often wanted to read was the Bible. And if I can tell you some of the primary sources that I've read where for reading the Bible, a slave master gouged a slave's eyes, gouged it with a stoke from a fire, from the fire. I mean, you can't tell me nothing's changed. You can't tell me that. I've seen too much. I know too much. You can't tell me that. But there are patterns of things. And the prison system represents a kind of cyclical thing, where you lock people away from the ability to vote, ability to get an education. You lock them away from society, much like those plantations locked people away. And so there is a semblance of it where you use their labor for little and nothing, because some of you may know that these prison systems, big corporations will use these prisons as labor, cheap labor. What is that? That doesn't bode well. And we should never be engaged in anything that is even vaguely reminiscent of that period, if we're truly repentant for having gone through that. So that's my thing. I do say The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander is great on the details of the prison system, and lots of good people doing good stuff on, Free America is a great program doing good work on, examining the prison system and its disproportionate effect on people of color. Doesn't mean that some people who are there don't need to be there. Some people who are there need to be there. I don't care what color they are, if they need to be there. But there's a disproportionate effect. And that's the problem. Like, why are Why are they overrepresented in the prison system and underrepresented in other areas? That's what we have to ask ourselves. That's definitely connected to the legacy of slavery. Thank you for that question.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so how do we middle of the road historians who see the positives of teaching both the 1619 and 1776 curriculum deal with the anger from both sides?
That's a good question. Oh, good question. Let me tell you the number one thing you do. You model reconciliation. Does that make sense? You model it. You don't just talk it, you model it. You set ground rules for the way people are going to talk, the way they're going to share. You give them a sense that they're free to share their views. This is what I try to do. I do not do it perfectly. I don't think anybody could do it perfectly. I wanted to say, I said to a group recently, earlier this week, a group that I was talking to, I said, you know, if this was so easy, we wouldn't be in the situation we were in 157 years later. If this was if reconciliation was that easy, it would have been done, right? So it's not easy, but we have to really work at it. And we have to work at ways, some great curriculum like Teaching Tolerance, I think really tries to help people think through how to talk about these issues, how to allow diverse groups in your classroom, in your community, in your library, to have discussions about these things, in your home even, without demonizing one another, right? I think you have to model that. You've got to give people a space to speak their mind. But to speak it in a respectful way, in a way that does not harm the inner person of somebody else. I think we have to model that. And I think we have to provide a lot of educational resources. Can I just tell you, the more people read, the more they learn. They come to these conclusions on their own. Trust me, they just do. I don't indoctrinate students or groups. I don't. If I have like 4 months with my students, I just share what there is. I just share this history, and a student who comes in from the beginning and who I thought, what's this all about? Slavery's a long time ago. Why don't you want to talk about that? By the end, they're telling me, when are the reparations coming? They're telling me, where are the reparations? They've gotten that far to that direction without me even prompting or saying anything about that. Because I really don't like to be political. I just want to share with them these various perspectives and let them make up their own mind. So that's one of the ways that you do it. You have to model it, and you have to provide a lot of information, and hope that people come along with you, and try to divorce themselves from the contentiousness and the noise that's around us.
Okay, I think we already lost Teresa for a minute here, so I'll ask the next one. So this next question is part question, part statement, but it says, can we look at logic differently in this case? The lack of information about slavery appears to be very logical if the evaluation of African contributions is part of the programming process.
Say that last part again, Misty.
It says the lack of information about slavery appears to be very logical if the valuation of African contributions is part of the programming process.
Oh, I mean, I use that word agency. I hope that's people understand what I mean. It just means Black contribution to the making of America or the Americas, right? So remember, we got to think wider, transatlantic contributions, right? And if I may say this, just as an aside, one of the reasons why I know this work can help even change our political stances, and I'm not talking about, well, who you vote for or whatever, but just what you believe in, what you believe happened and what you believe should happen and so forth, is that when people start talking about, well, America first, as if we exist like in an island, right? When you really look at this history, you realize, no, wait a minute, we've been connected. There's so many connections all over the place, and they've always been. It's not today or yesterday or this last century. It's always been that we exist in a transatlantic history, and we need to get better. We need to know more about it. So back to this whole idea of contributions. Yes, I think there is a connection. There really is. If you, just as I did with the Haiti example, if you downplay the revolution and what that meant, right? If you downplay the revolution and what it meant, that by definition, right? If you downplay what it meant, then by definition, you're saying, well, Haiti contributed nothing. It's just a poor country. That's really what you're saying, right? You can then create a new narrative about Haiti because you didn't tell, the old narrative correctly. I don't care what's happening now. You can't deny that to be the first Black republic, in an age of slavery is a major, major achievement. To defeat Napoleon? Hello, the great Napoleon? This ragtag army of enslaved people defeated Napoleon. Can you imagine what American Blacks felt when they heard their masters talking about this? The ones who could read, who snuck away to read and could read, and they're looking in the newspapers and they're like, what happened? What? Can you just imagine the excitement? Can you just imagine? I can tell you that some of the Southern Black slaves, they created songs about Haiti. How about that? They created songs about Haiti and how they got their freedom and how we're next. We're next. So, I say all this to say that, yes, there's a connection between not telling the full story of this period and of course, then not valuing the people who were actors in the story. There is a connection, but once you start to peel this away, the whole idea of contribution then becomes a multicultural contribution, not just a white male contribution, but like a multicultural contribution to the history of America.
Okay. I'll read
Wait,
the
Tracy,
next
back.
question. Yes, I'm back. I follow SDPL on Instagram and saw information about tonight's program there. I was shocked to see the following comment that I saw only fleetingly, so I may not be quoting, but in essence, it said, slavery and or the auction, the person said, never happened. Wow, what can you say to that?
I haven't been, as you know, a lot of us are working from home, and I do go, and I'm near my school. We do go occasionally, but we don't have to go all the time because we're working like this remotely. So I say this to say I haven't checked my mailbox recently at school. Maybe there's a lot of hate mail there, but the last time I checked, there has not been a lot or much at all, to be quite honest with you. And I'm thankful for that, because there are some of us, to be frank, that share this knowledge here and around the world that are the object of a lot of hate. I don't know if you know that, but there are some of us who have had to endure literally slurs and all kinds of things. It is a risk that we take, and I take it too. But I will say this, I have occasionally had, especially when those Confederate statues, and I write about the Confederate issue, right? I write about the fact that what should happen to these statues and the history of them and so forth and so forth. And when there were different activists taking some of them down last summer, and I responded in a I can't remember what the name of I can't remember what my headline was, but I responded by saying, what were some of the reasons behind either taking them down or keeping them up or what have you, like what things that they should consider, right? By the way, I'm on record as saying, don't take down public property, find a way to advocate for them to come down legally. But I do think they should come down, all right? But come down legally. Anyway, I say all this to say that with the Confederate statues and with my own, intervention, I started getting some mail. When you start talking about Confederate statues, you get mail. And I had this one writer, one citizen who wrote me, and he was very, very angry, said something to that effect, right? And I took my time and I carefully answered point by point by point. I just engaged him as another human being. in my view, a misinformed human being, but another human being. Unfortunately, he didn't respond back, but that's, that is what it is, but I think that's kind of, I don't know if that says anything, but that's kind of my response. I believe in reconciliation, and I know more than most the education gap. And we're not talking about how many degrees you have, because this person could have, maybe he's got his PhD in something, but all of us on some level have been miseducated about this history. And so we have some gut reaction feelings. We have people who tell us what to think, about these things. We have a lot of noise and chatter. And I just take my time and respond. I mean, that's all I can say. And if they want to engage with me, I want to hear them. And I also tell them that, guess what? I don't know everything either. I'm still learning. There's that much to learn. I've dedicated decades to this, but it's that much to learn that I don't know everything. So come along on this journey with me. That's what I would say to him.
Thank you. That's, and I think you made this point earlier about education and how important education is. And so this question kind of speaks to that. In addition to your own book, do you recommend any particular books for general readers that provide an accurate background on the history and legacy of slavery in America?
I recommend many books. There is no one book that I would honestly suggest. I mean, and I really mean that. I could just mention a few, because they're all, it's like there's a panorama that gives you a fuller picture. And then going back to my stance about multiple perspectives and how important it is to have, okay, so if you want, you can read my book, that's fine. But that's just one perspective, right? Read some other perspectives on this period. I think most of the reputable historians, we will find a lot of agreement in many ways, but sometimes we'll have a different way of looking at things. So, Deirdre Cooper Owens, for example, writes about, her book is called Medical Bondage, and she writes about the history of slavery from the point of view, this is perfect for your program actually, of enslaved women who were used as, in the experimentation by the first gynecologists, gynecology, the person who's considered Marion Sims, who's considered the father of gynecology. And if you go to medical school today, you will hear that he's the father of gynecology, used enslaved women that he purchased or borrowed from plantations in the South. And later on, by the way, he also used Irish immigrant women. So you see how this thing has a continuum, right? In New York. But the most egregious stuff that he did was in the South with these enslaved women to come up with his, various gynecological advances that we still use, apparently. So, I don't write about medical history, right? But I know about this history. So you're going to get a deeper dive into this piece. Does that make sense? So they're just different. Each of us have a different piece of the puzzle. And, again, these are not new records. So going back to the question that you read, Dean Bird, for the person who would ask about, did these things happen? I mean, you can look at it for yourself, I mean, if they engage, they will see that Marion Sims wrote an autobiography about all of this. There wasn't any political correctness. So, I mean, he didn't have any, he didn't have any reason to be ashamed, if you will, aside from his own conscience, that he had used these women in these experiments without anesthesia. On top of
I have one last question.
Mm-hmm.
This is our last question for the evening. Mm-hmm. Moving forward, how do individuals help meet our nation's ideals?
I hope that, some of what I presented is really like a vision question, right? It's a vision issue. And, people sometimes, and this happens all the time, and I totally understand this. I'm also have a very practical side as well. And people very often want to know, well, what do I do? Now that I know this, what do I do? Well, first of all, I'll say, you don't know enough. So I'll say, let's be in the midst of what I'd like to call an educational revolution. Let's start one, let's start an education revolution where we really, these beautiful libraries, which you have, and, I think some people think that libraries are dead. They're not. and they're more necessary than any time in our history are they necessary. And I believe that so fully and completely. Swing those doors open and be a part of that revolution, even more so, as much as we can. I think we need to educate ourselves. I think we need to educate our families. I think we need to educate our coworkers. We need to be a part of that process, whether it's reading groups, what have you, not just formal education, formal and informal education. I think that's the main way we're going to turn the corner. Does this make sense? And my students taught me this. My students said to me, but how can we have all these things? How can we have all these great changes if we have no consensus? That's what they said to me. We don't have any consensus about these things. Okay, we've just learned all of this. So we all have a consensus now, multicultural class of Blacks, Asians, Latinos, et cetera. But like, what about everybody else? We only get there through education and sharing and giving each other a little bit of grace to sometimes make mistakes, not get it right, but we want to get it right. So thank you for asking that question. Education, education, education. Never feel like you've had enough. Never feel like your degrees define who you are. They do not, because of our education system has been hiding a lot of this. So we need to kind of go back and get it. And I think that's what's going to help us turn the corner. One of the things which will. Thank you for asking. Thank you for the questions. Brilliant, great questions. Thank you. I appreciate it. Very engaged.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Dr. Bailey. It's just an incredible program, and I hope for everyone that this is the start of continuing their education on this subject. And I know both, Dr. Bird and I in libraries are ready to swing those doors wide open and be part of it. Yeah. So thank you so much. Everyone, please, there's still the link at the bottom of the screen to purchase Dr. Bailey's book, The Weeping Time. It is an incredible read. I think just really gives a very accurate picture of what really happened, and should be necessary reading for everyone. So thank you all. Dr. Bird, do you have any
just want to
words?
say thank you to everyone for attending. We look forward to seeing you here next year, same time, same place. We hope we're going to be either at the public library or on campus next year. We have a wonderful reception, and we enjoy having the community come in, and people stay to 10 o'clock at night. So this is a bit different for us. But Dr. Bailey, I want to say it's been fantastic. And thank you for reminding us that it's not just 1619 or 1776, but that it's both. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.